And for the next 25 or 30 minutes, I think we're just going to focus on control testing, which is quite a popular subject, just given the amount of registrations that we have this morning. So we'll just focus on some of the basic concepts and step through kind of what a design effectiveness test might look like, what an operating effectiveness test might look like, and things like that. But maybe before we jump into the detail, just for those of you who haven't joined us in any of our webinars before, just a quick introduction to who we are and I suppose what we do. So we're a company called calQrisk, and most of our backgrounds are in risk and compliance. So we're members of the Institute of Risk Management, the Institute of Directors, the ACCA, ISACA. I myself have risk management qualifications from the likes of the Institute of Risk Management, the Institute of Banking, the Professional Risk Managers International Association, and many others. So we do keep our knowledge up to date with kind of moving practices around risk management, control testing, corporate governance and compliance, and other items like that as well. If you're not familiar with calQrisk, we offer a governance, risk, and compliance software solution and associated services. So everything from framework reviews, training, reporting reviews, assurance reviews, and everything else in between. So that's a bit about us. These slides will be sent out to everyone afterwards. So if there's any detail or anything that we skip over too quick, the webinar is being recorded, and we will circulate both the recording and the actual slide deck afterwards as well. So just to jump straight in then today, or what we're going to look at actually this morning. So I suppose the first thing we'll look at is probably just having a look at the different types of controls. And really what we're going to focus here is maybe just getting a bit of a baseline understanding to make sure we're all on the same page as to what we mean when we talk about preventive controls or corrective controls or directive controls or whatever categories or labels you might have in-house. Everyone will be slightly different here. I think we're just going to focus on a handful or maybe three to start with, but everyone will be slightly different in the way you categorize controls. Why do control testing? This is just going to be some of the benefits of control testing. Some of it's going to be self-explanatory. Some of it you may already know, but just a quick recap on why organizations do control testing and what benefits they can expect to kind of receive from it. We'll then have a look at a control testing process. So the way we like to break it down is to have a look at both the design effectiveness test and then also an operating effectiveness test. So a lot of organizations can be guilty of just jumping straight in and saying, is this control effective or not effective? We like to break it down into two components and saying, actually, is the control designed well? Take a step back and then say yes or no, and then move on to an operating effectiveness test. So we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail shortly too. We'll then have a look at a practical example, probably a control that we've all actually experienced in our personal lives anyway. And then we'll finish off the webinar then by just chatting a small bit about reporting and maybe some good practices that we've seen ourselves and people reporting to an audit and risk committee or a board of directors or whoever it might be around control testing. But again, every organization is going to be slightly different there. And maybe just before we jump into some of the kind of nitty gritty and the detail on that, what might be good actually is just if we just start with a quick poll, if that's okay with everyone, just to see where everyone is at in terms of actual control testing. So hopefully everyone can see that on their screen. So just, do you currently operate a control testing program? There's nothing wrong with not having a control testing program. I think we just popped up three options here. So yes, it's defined, as in you have a define, it's in your framework or policy document. Yes, it's ad hoc, probably not in your policy documentation. It might be something you do as part of a post-mortem type review of an incident, or you do a deep dive because a regulator says so, or it's thematic. And then no pretty much explains itself. We don't have a control testing program, and you're probably here just to learn a bit about the fundamentals of control testing. So we've quite a few people on the webinar this morning, so over 200 and odd by the looks of things. So the results are still ticking up here. So I'm just going to end the poll here and see if we can share it. So it looks like a lot of people do have a control testing program already in place, and it's defined as well, which is great, basically. So hopefully you do pick up something from today's webinar, even if it is just insights into how other organizations or maybe some bits and pieces as to how we do it. Those of you who have it ad hoc, maybe it's because of an incident happened, or a regulatory review, or a thematic review, or an internal audit finding, whatever it is, you'll pick up something today as well around how we can kind of formalize that process, what's expected in terms of documentation and things like that. And in those of you who don't have a control testing program, maybe you're not quite there yet in terms of your risk management maturity, and maybe it's something you want to build out in the next few months. So you'll probably pick up a lot as well during the process or during the webinar here this morning too. And then maybe just kick it straight off then. So I think we're going to have a look at the different types of controls, as I mentioned, just before we do that deep dive into actual control testing. So the different types of controls that we have. Again, I mentioned at the very beginning, lots of organizations will have maybe 5 or 6 different categories. I'm going to keep it quite simple here and quite high level. So I'm just going to explore there's 3 different control types. So preventive or preventative controls. Basically, the objective there is to avoid something happening. The reason why we put those in place is to stop a risk materializing. So we don't want to feel the impact of that risk, basically. So these controls basically reduce the likelihood. So we think about a risk, we rate it on likelihood and consequence, or probability and impact. what we want those preventative controls or preventive controls to really do here is to reduce the likelihood of that risk materializing. Examples there, things like firewalls to stop people getting in or out, or files getting in or out, links, whatever it might be, password management systems, not to get too technical there, and things like that too. Detective controls, they're kind of straightforward. They identify or detect when incidents basically happen or when the risk materializes. So at that point in time, they let us know something has actually happened. Again, those controls tend to be quite automated. To pick an example, a technical example, they can be monitoring systems or log alerts. So anyone here on the call that's probably with an IT background, you probably have some sort of IT alerting system that lets you know about suspicious activity. We would almost call them detective controls, and that they're alerting us to say, hang on, actually, this has happened. We didn't expect it to happen. So that's post-event, if that makes sense. And then the last category I just wanted to kind of touch on then was the corrective controls. And really the idea is the corrective control is right. The preventative control, maybe we didn't have one, or maybe it's after failing. The corrective control, then the objective really of those type of controls is to minimize the impact or consequence that the organization feels. So the risk has materialized, the loss event has happened, or whatever way we want to phrase it. And really what those controls are aimed to do is to reduce the impact that the organization feels. They might be things like incident response plans, data restore processes. Some organizations will have what they call bad news communication strategies, or something has happened and we have our press releases pre-prepared and things like that as well. So lots we can do there on the corrective. A lot of organizations will obviously focus on the preventive. We don't want that risk to materialize, but it can be good to have a look at the controls across these three pillars or these three buckets, if you like. I mentioned as well, organizations will have different controls. Some will talk about compensating controls, for example. These are just controls that maybe if a primary control fails, it's a backup. It's something that we might not worry about too much. It's there to kind of help us if something does fall over. Manual checks, four eyes checks, things like that can be useful for compensating controls. Directive controls then, these kind of fall into the same bucket as preventative, but sometimes I think a lot of organizations can get mixed up between the two. They tell people what to do. You could argue that they're also preventive controls as well. My big piece of advice for anyone starting out in control testing or any kind of sort of even control management program is don't necessarily worry about too much about over categorization here. Really what we want to do is focus on strong controls, really clear control statements that we know what the control is meant to do, really strong control objectives, and just start with 2 or 3 kind of control categories or control buckets, if you like. Don't get too worried about having 5, 6, 7, or 8 control categories. That will come with time. But yeah, a lot of the time you can get bogged down and worrying about which control is belonging into which category basically as well. I think the next thing we'll have a look at then is why should we be doing control testing? And look, this is fairly self-explanatory. Lots of us on the call will already know why we're doing it, particularly those of you who've already said you have a control testing program. Basically, it's one of the big impacts we see is less incidents, less risk events, less loss events, or whatever we want to call it. So by having a robust control environment, really what we're basically saying is we have less cost. We don't have any remediation costs, any corrective costs. We don't have to pay our customers, clients, members compensation or whatever it might be because we have a data breach. There's less reputation damage because we're not on the front of the Data Protection Commissioner's website or the ICO's website or whatever regulator we might be worried about. The next thing then is a robust risk management pretty much calls for it, to be honest. Lots of organizations will do RCSAs or risk and control self-assessments, really, really strong on the risk piece. So really strong in saying this risk is a 4 on my likelihood scale and a 3 on my impact scale. And then when it gets to the controls, it's almost like the effort then or the project or the work stream kind of dies down a small bit when it comes to actually rating controls. My personal opinion is that a lot of organizations slip there in the risk management process or in the RCSA process is because we don't know how to do control testing. It might not be that well defined. When we think about it internally, lots of organizations will have things like risk criteria or risk impact matrix. Very few organizations will have defined criteria on how we test a control. How do we know that control is robust in terms of design and operating effectiveness? So that's where we talk about that risk management process, and particularly on the RCSA, where a lot of organizations are already doing quarterly, 6-monthly, annual RCSAs. But yeah, do go down to the next level of detail if you're there, if that makes sense in terms of actually rating the controls as well. The next thing is then provides assurance to relevant stakeholders. To be honest here, as a risk function or as a compliance function or whatever, any sort of control function with whoever's on the call, really, the idea is that it actually gives you peace of mind as well. And to be quite frank, it's actually good for business. So while we do talk a lot about it'll provide auditors, regulators, investors, any other interested stakeholder kind of assurance, the reality is that it just makes our life easier. If we've less kind of explaining to do, there's less incidents, it gives you the peace of mind that we're not going to fall over. If it's a payment system or a CRM system or whatever it is, the reality is that everything should be pretty much fine if we have a robust control environment. The last two are somewhat linked, and I purposely left them at the very bottom because a lot of the time we jump to the conclusion that we have to do control testing or we have to implement these controls because the regulator says so. And I purposely left the regulatory and the compliance piece down the bottom of this slide, more so to say that having robust controls is actually good for business. We work with firms or organizations of some are regulated, some are not regulated, some are just doing control testing because it's good for business. I would encourage anyone like that to be doing control testing. And if you're doing it well and you have a robust control framework in place, you're almost guaranteed compliance, if that makes sense. So a regulator might call for us to have a robust IT risk management framework or outsourcing or business continuity plans or whatever it is. But the reality is, if we're thinking of our controls across those three different buckets of detective, corrective, and preventive, we should be almost satisfying a lot of our legal and compliance obligations as well. So I won't say compliance is secondary, but it's certainly a benefit of having a robust kind of control testing process and robust control management framework in place. And then I suppose moving on to why we're probably all here this morning is to actually get down into the nitty-gritty of that control testing process then. So when we talk about the control testing process, I already alluded to at the very beginning that I like to break it up into a couple of different steps, and mostly the design effectiveness and operating effectiveness. So taking a step back, we're looking at this control and we're saying, is it designed properly? And that, I mean, is it actually going to mitigate the risk that we hope it's going to mitigate, or is it going to mitigate multiple risks? Really what we're looking at here, we're thinking of a checklist of different components that the controls should have in place. And we don't want to have to create different checklists for different controls. So when we're thinking of design effectiveness, let's think about how we can introduce a concept of almost like a checklist or a standard internally, right across the organization. For every control we introduce, how can we have a list or a checklist of components or items that we expect that control to have, basically? And we'll come on to an example there shortly. But basically, the design effectiveness test pretty much does what it says on the tin. Is the control designed well? We're not worried about operating effectiveness just yet. If the control does pass that design effectiveness test, then we move on to operating effectiveness. Not much point in worrying about operating effectiveness if we know the control isn't designed well. Let's focus all our time and effort in fixing the control design before we worry about testing a control that we know is not designed well, if that makes sense. The operating effectiveness, this is really just testing to see, is the control operating as designed? So we've already had a look at the procedure, the policy, or whatever it is, documentation about the control. Is the control operating as expected, as defined in those documents? Really here, what we're looking for is a sample of the controls. So can we go out into the organization and find the sample of that control working? Lots of organizations will, I won't say fail here, but maybe slip here a small bit. And by that I mean is that they'll have really well designed controls, but when it comes to putting the controls in practice, it's where they can maybe slip a small bit. It might be that there's a key person dependency or something else, or the control just doesn't operate well. So it's not unusual for controls to pass lots of design effectiveness testing and maybe fail at some of the operating effectiveness piece. Perfectly normal. The last two steps I just wanted to touch on, we're not going to delve into these in huge detail this morning, but just to talk a bit about assurance. So those of you who operate a typical three-line of defense model or three lines model, you might think of a second or third line as probably operating some of the assurance roles. So they may do their own. So if we have an internal audit function or an audit function, they may do their own control testing, their own sampling as part of their normal work. But they also might do some sampling of the actual control tests themselves if the first line are carrying them out. So this point is maybe only specific or applicable to those in larger organizations who are operating that three-line model. But just think about how the assurance function, that be it second line or third line, can be useful to you in your organization as you roll out a control testing program or potentially refresh your existing control testing program. And the last piece then is reporting. And I mentioned that as earlier, just when we touched on the agenda. The real piece around the reporting is it's where I see a lot of organizations, I won't say get it wrong if that makes sense, but it's like we've done so many control tests and then we send the board or a committee everything. And it's almost like 95% of it is green, but really what we want to focus on is just the 5% that's red, if that makes sense. So it's where a lot of organizations slip up. So we'll have a quick look at that shortly as well. I should have actually mentioned as well, I see someone has just popped in a question here as well in the Q&A. Please do feel free to pop questions in the Q&A box as well. And as we finish up, I'm going to try leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end as well. And I do have a quick FAQ slide too that we'll touch on. But please do pop questions in the Q&A box as we step through them too. So we're going to just have a quick look at what we might look at in a design effectiveness test. This is not an exact science, just before we get down to nitty gritty. Every organization, as I said, is going to be slightly different. This is just a quick example, rough and ready, around some of the things that if I was going into an organization today and I had to do a design effectiveness test on a piece of paper in 5 minutes, this is what I did, some of the things that I would probably look at. I would look for evidence. So is there a documented procedure, something that dictates what this control is? What's the control objective? Is the control statement clear? Is there an operating procedure, how the control should work, or some sort of guidance as to how the control operates? One thing, having the guidance, but does it live on Chris's laptop and Chris is on holidays in Spain for 2 weeks and isn't contactable? So where is it stored? Is it easily acceptable? Are roles and responsibilities defined in the document? So does it lay out who does what, when, basically? And then is it up to date? So a lot of times people introduce controls, particularly around regulatory requirements. So if we think of things like the introduction of GDPR, for example, or whatever, any sort of large scale regulatory change, lots of organizations will go and introduce lots of new controls, but unfortunately that control documentation can age quite quickly if we don't keep it up to date and build it into our existing processes. So it's one thing just having the piece of paper, but when we're doing the evidence check, we should be looking for a couple more things underneath that. The key person risk. So I mentioned that as well. Does the evidence live on my laptop, for example, and I'm away, it's not in Teams or Google Drive or OneDrive or anything like that? So does the control depend on one person? What happens if that person's not available, basically? We've seen countless examples of this, particularly from a data security or information security point of view, where someone is actually named in something like an incident response plan. Their mobile number might be there as well, their email address, but they might have left the organization 6 months ago, or they could be on leave or whatever it might be. So just being conscious that as we're checking the design effectiveness, of a test, of a control, is there a key to person dependency within that actual control, and what can we do to reduce that key person dependency as well? Just having a quick check around, is the control automated or manual? There is obviously a preference around automated controls on the assumption that they work all the time as well, and we'll catch that as part of our operating effectiveness test. A lot of organizations will kind of say manual controls, there's a dependency on someone or a group of people. So the preference is to go more for automated controls. And if it's not automated, just getting a better understanding of what the manual control is. Again, can it operate that key person dependency as well? Then looking at some of the things we already touched on earlier in the webinar, the control type, prevention, detection, or correction. Really what we're looking at there is, again, lots of organizations will focus on the prevention or preventative controls. And what we want to kind of have a look at here is, why are we introducing these controls? So we want to put a lot of time and effort into our preventive controls to stop a material incident happening or material risks are materializing. And then our corrective and detective controls, then organizations will put those in as post events. So we think of that almost like that bow tie slide, if anyone's familiar with that. We organizations tend to focus a lot on the left-hand side of the incident, and we put a lot of controls in place on preventive, and that's where we focus in terms of some of our design effectiveness. But we'll have a quick look at the detection and correction as well, as we already alluded to. I already mentioned as well that from the design effectiveness piece, if the control just isn't designed well, don't move on to operating effectiveness testing. There's just no point. You're only going and checking is a poorly designed control working well. So it's almost after failing the first test, basically. So please don't move on. And as I mentioned as well, this isn't an exact science. So do find what works best for your organization. These are just 3 or 4 kind of high level points that are applicable to almost any organization that wants to do control testing. I said there are huge benefits if we can kind of make that checklist something that we can roll out across the organization. So it's not that we have a control checklist or a control design effectiveness checklist for every single control. It's a template that we can reuse as we're doing our control testing on design effectiveness. Let's say hypothetically, so we pass that design effectiveness test and we want to move over to our operating effectiveness. This is really more of a mini audit, for example, and I talk a lot about sampling or sample the control. So is the control operating as designed? So we've gone and said that actually, look, there's guidance notes, there's documentation around how this control works. The control objective and statement is clear. We know the key person, the roles and responsibilities. Can we actually go out now and evidence that? So if I want to go out into an organization and I want to go and see, look, I need to go and sample this control. It operates every week. So I'm going to go and check 5 examples of in the last quarter, for example. Is it operating as planned? Is there evidence of this? So can the control owner evidence that the control operated, that we did this on this date as expected according to the documentation? Does it always happen? And that's the reason why we look for more than one sample as well. So no point in going and trying to find a sample. If a control operates daily and we want to go and just pick a sample from 6 months ago, we want to look for evidence and maybe some exceptions of where the control potentially didn't operate as expected. So that's why the sampling and sample sizes are important as well. Maybe to stay moving then to that then as well. So just to kind of touch on a kind of practical example, and when I was thinking about this, I'm chatting internally about it, I was looking for an example that rather than trying to pick something technical or like IT or something like that, I was almost looking for something that we probably all experienced in our day-to-day lives. So when we think about probably all applied for car loans, mortgages, or something like that. So we've all been subject to some sort of credit control or credit worthiness assessment, if that makes sense. So in this example that we're going to look at, just around how to do a design effectiveness test and an operating effectiveness test, let's just pretend that we're a financial institution. We're exposed to credit risk like any financial institution, a bank, whatever it might be. We offer small to medium loan to borrowers. So we might offer car loans or whatever it might be. And then the control that we're going to focus on is our credit worthiness control. So it's our pre-loan control, basically. When we're thinking about this, then we're just going to apply those principles that we just had. So we're thinking about the design effectiveness, and we're saying documentation. Yeah, there's a documented step-by-step procedure in place that documents or details exactly how this control operates. So the pieces that we check from the borrower and everything else. Roles and responsibilities. Where are these defined? Are they clear? Does everyone know what to do? If I'm listed in the document, am I actually trained in it? So do we actually go out and almost interview people, if that makes sense? And we might leave that to the operating effectiveness piece then as well. The key person. Is there any key person dependency? If the documentation is quite good, the reality is that there shouldn't be key person dependency. If the roles and responsibilities are well laid out, hopefully more than one person can operate the control. And likewise, in this dummy organization, more than one person can operate the control. Is it automated? Unfortunately, for this dummy organization, it's actually manual control due to the cost of automating. So this dummy organization can't afford some sort of screening software or whatever it might be. So we manually sit down and we go through all our bank statements to figure out if there's any unusual transactions, and we plug it all into a spreadsheet and we try and do a calculation as to how much this person can borrow. Purely down to cost, that's the reason why we haven't automated this control. And then the control type is preventive. So as I mentioned, that can just be a piece of information, or you can build it into your design effectiveness test. The reason why this is a preventive control is that we're putting this control in place to avoid credit risk, basically, or to avoid any potential bad debt. So we want to check, is the borrower able to repay their loan on the assumption that we grant them a loan? And this is obviously going to prevent any potential bad debt that we might incur. If I look at this across the design effectiveness test, and again, this can, as I mentioned, it's not an exact science and it can be somewhat subjective, but just kind of ran some kind of quick tick marks and X's kind of along the side. So I said, yeah, documentation was solid, roles and responsibilities are solid. There was no key person dependency risk. Control type was preventative, so I put a tick beside that. But unfortunately, the control isn't automated, so it's manual. But it's after passing the design effectiveness test, in my opinion. And the reason why I feel it's passed the design effectiveness test is that a lot of the fundamentals are actually there as the control. So it's quite clear, there's no key person risk, documentation is good, roles and responsibilities are clearly outlined. It's a nice preventative control. And the reason why we haven't automated is just costs might be prohibitive, for example. So in this dummy example, what I would actually do is I would actually suggest that if I was in this organization and I was doing the control test, I would actually go out and do the operating effectiveness test next. So in terms of the operating effectiveness, again, just kind of have a look at, just to bring our theory from our previous kind of slide or two ago around how would we actually do this operating effectiveness test. So we need to go and sample. We need to obtain an adequate sample size. And think of the sample size as linking it back to the frequency in which the control operates. So if it's an annual control, something like a procedure review or something like that, maybe just checking 1 or 2 samples in the last few years is more than adequate. If it's something that happens daily, maybe we should check 20 in the last 2 months or in the last 3 months. Again, I would suggest having this all laid out in your control testing guidance or your risk management framework internally. So have some sample size guidelines or some sample size criteria built in here. When you get down to the operating effectiveness testing, it's very easy to burn a lot of time and effort down at this level if we don't have kind of clear guidance. So when we're actually doing the testing here, so let's say we've gathered up our sample, we want to do the testing. As I mentioned already, we're just checking, is the control operating as designed? So we're going back to those 5 or 6 things that we had on the previous slide. And really in this kind of dummy example, we would probably just look at loan applications, a review of the paperwork, a review of the comms internally around that. We could potentially do some interviews and walkthroughs, depending on how robust you want your control testing process to be. You might actually decide, you know what, I'm going to go out and I'm going to talk to the people who do this control. I'm going to go talk to the control owner and the control operator. So who does the creditworthiness control, who does the credit checks. I'm going to go and interview them, see are they operating the control exactly as designed, have the evidence. So is there evidence that we're doing all these 5 or 6 things that might be laid out? And can they actually walk me through an example? Can we take a sample from today, yesterday, and walk me through that? Or can we actually do a real-time example as well? So This is why I'm so kind of strong on that point of not going into operating effectiveness testing unless you know design effectiveness is really good, because operating effectiveness testing can burn time unless you have quite a few people in your risk and control function or whoever it might be that's actually doing the testing there. So on the assumption that we pass the operating effectiveness test, I'm just going to touch on the reporting piece. And I mentioned that it will skip the assurance piece, just purely because it's not applicable to some organizations might not have their own internal assurance function and things like that. So when we're thinking about recording and reporting, really we want to start thinking around how we're going to report this upwards. So to an audit and risk committee, a non-exec board, a board of directors, or whatever it might be, or even a management team. My biggest piece of advice here is to build it in rather than bolting it on. And by that I mean is that some organizations will almost like overcorrect, for example. So we will go and we'll introduce control testing programs. We'll do it really well for 3 months. We'll have a control testing paper that will go to the board and our committee, but then it starts to fizzle away. So what I would suggest is that we build it into our existing risk reporting. It might just be a 1 page or a graph or a diagram or whatever it is. And that brings us on to that point and making it a continuous process. Don't have it as a once a year, 1 week sprint of an exercise. It's much easier to get buy-in when it's part of a continuous process. So think about it if you already operated a risk and control self-assessment process or that RCSA process, build it in there. And then in my opinion, the reporting works really well when you report by exception. So when you're going to the board of directors and you already have lots of information of 95+% of your controls have already passed, really what we want the board to focus on is maybe the reds, the controls that aren't effective or key controls or whatever it might be. Just some examples or samples of kind of really kind of interactive dashboards, kind of simple diagrams that we can kind of present up to the board with some high level information behind it, pie charts, bar charts around effectiveness if we want to go and start rating controls and things like that. A lot of it will depend on your own internal maturity as well, though, of how you kind of categorize all of this stuff and where you want to report. And then kind of lastly, just going to bring us up onto the half-hour mark. And I said I did say I want to kind of leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end to probably just touch on a couple of questions. Was when I think of control testing, there's almost a couple of questions that I always get asked as well around control testing. So I just popped some of them on a slide, and I'm conscious we have some questions here that I'm going to try and answer as well on the webinar too. So who should conduct the control test? Get asked this all the time. If you're operating a 3-line model, the best way you can do control testing is that the control owner should test the control. And that could be someone in the first line or second line or whatever it might be. But the reality is that it's the person who does the control the control owner should test the control. It's nothing wrong with it having an assurance function, like a risk management function or an audit function, who'll also do their own testing and sampling. But to really build it into that kind of RCSA process, it really works well when we get the control owner to kind of buy in and own the control as well as the testing. How often should I test the controls? This, again, is down to each individual organization. I would certainly be suggesting that any control that we class as key or that mitigates several risks or that reduces like a red risk down to an amber risk or green risk or however you score risks in your organization, that we should consider testing those at least on an annual basis on a full design effectiveness and operating effectiveness test. How big should my sample be for operating effectiveness testing? I probably answered this one already. If it's something like it's a daily control, think about capturing 20 samples in the last kind of quarter. If it's weekly or monthly, maybe a handful in the last quarter. If it's annual, you're probably only going to be able to get one in the last maybe year or two or something like that anyway. So really, my big piece of advice here is to have that laid out. So there's no ambiguity or we're not unclear basically when we get down into the operating effectiveness testing as to how big that sample needs to be. It should be laid out in my documentation and my criteria should be quite clear. Here's my design effectiveness checklist. When I'm getting into the operating effectiveness, here's how we should do that basically as well. And then the last piece, which I didn't actually touch on in the slide deck, and we often get asked is, what happens actually when a control fails a test? The reality is here, if a control fails a design effectiveness or an operating effectiveness testing, we think about the immediate. So we think about putting that action plan in place to make the control more robust. Either we need to go and enhance the documentation, get rid of that key person risk, automate it, or whatever it might be. And likewise with the operating effectiveness, if we notice that it's actually failing at operating effectiveness, it might be a training issue, a documentation issue, an awareness issue, whatever it might be. But there's also a step that a lot of organizations leave out. We forget to go back to our risk register a lot of the time. So if that control is mitigating a risk that could potentially be my top 10 risks or my top 20 risks or whatever way you think of your risk register, the idea here basically is to make sure that if that control is failing, do you need to increase the residual level of risk on your risk register? So if we have a key control, there's evidence that it's after failing, Do we need to go back and rescore that residual level of risk on that key risk, and then update that when we go to the board or an audit and risk committee as well? So I said we always think about putting out the immediate fire and enhancing the control, but that might take us 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or whatever it might be. So don't forget to go back and have a look at the actual risk register as well. And I think that's really it for me in terms of the slides. That's it. Today was just a quick half hour, I think, focused on the concept of control testing around the design effectiveness and operating effectiveness, and just a quick example on how we might do both. There are some questions in the Q&A box here, so I'm just going to pop on the questions. Is it okay to rely upon compliance review testing to inform risk control tests to avoid duplication? It's a really good example, and this is back to that piece around the assurance that I mentioned as well. So for those of you who do have a second line or third line function, it's perfectly normal for them to do their own control testing as well. If it's not part of your CSA process, there's nothing in theory wrong with letting them do the testing, as long as it informs your risk management process. So long as you have evidence of the control, it's enhancing your CSA process or whatever else it might be, that's normal. But do just have it again laid out in your internal control guidance and your framework guidance as well. Another question here, would you expect both first line and second line to do this, or just second line? In smaller companies, it might not be feasible for second line to do control testing. Absolutely, completely agree. And that's where I mentioned as well, in that I really like the concept of the first line control owners doing the control testing, especially if they're already doing a risk assessment process. It really helps them own and buy into the risk and control self-assessment process or risk assessment process or whatever we might call it. So completely understand that the second line function in smaller companies tends to be a good bit lighter than the first line. So yeah, first line is my preference, control owners outdoing the design effectiveness, operating effectiveness, and perhaps the second line just reporting and overseeing the whole process, if that makes sense. Any suggestions on software to help with sample size calculation and selection to deliver defensible sampling for assurance purposes? I really don't have any suggestions on a software that can provide sample size guidance or actually go out and collect the sample size. So much of it depends on if the control is automated or manual, and so again, so much of it depends on your own organization as well as to what controls it is and how you operate those controls as well. So I'm not too sure if there is a software out there, for example, that can go out and do the sample size and collect all the samples for you. But again, organizations are doing lots of clever things with like data warehouses and things like that at the moment, where control information is going back in there and things like that too. So unfortunately, I don't think I have an answer for that one. Is there functionality in calQrisk to calculate control effectiveness based on defined attributes? Absolutely, yeah. We can pick that up in the custom reporting tools. So that's one of our, looks like one of our users. So if you want to pop an email into the help desk, I'm more than happy to chat about that separately as well, about how we can automate that process too. Someone here has a question. It can be hard to determine if a control is designed effectively, independently of operating control. For instance, client risk assessment, the control for financial crime is hard to determine ex ante if the control risk assessment is defined effective without testing, if it has a risk discrimination power, predictive power. Would you agree, or am I mixing up my testing framework? I think about the design effectiveness testing though is just checking is the control designed robustly, if that makes sense. So before we worry too much about going out and seeing is it reducing the risk of financial crime or whatever it might be, let's take a step back and say, what is this control intended to do? What's the control objective? Is the control statement clear? Do we have clear roles and responsibilities? So break the test into two where possible. And I think in most cases, in 99+% of cases, I'm sure it is possible. I'm sure there's always going to be a couple of edge cases around the edge anyway, sorry, where it may not be possible. But really with the design effectiveness testing, we're just checking those core principles: documentation, roles and responsibilities, key person, and is the control well designed? That's really the objective of that design effectiveness test. So before we get into operating effectiveness, just make sure that the control is designed to do what you intend it to do, basically, and that everyone's aware of that. So without getting into the nitty-gritty of the file risk assessment or crime or financial crime risk assessment example. Can you explain the difference between control testing and monitoring key risk indicators? Absolutely, yeah. So the key risk indicators, lots of organizations have key risk indicator frameworks that are probably linked back to risks in their risk register or may live independently or whatever it is. Whereas the control testing is almost looking backwards, if that makes sense. So I think of KRIs as almost like forward-looking, early warning indicators. This is trending up or trending down. We need to act. Control testing is looking backwards. It's an audit almost. So it's saying this has happened, this has failed. Whereas I always think of key risk indicators as looking forward, early warning indicators. And sometimes on KRI, I almost think the trend is more valuable than the number that month or that quarter, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answered that question. If the operating effectiveness fails, would we assume that the design effectiveness is also problematic? Not necessarily. Where I've seen most operating effectiveness controls fail is actually that lack of awareness or lack of training, in that the control is designed really well. Documentation lives somewhere in OneDrive or SharePoint or Teams or whatever document management system you might actually have. But the reality is that the control owner is probably someone new, hasn't been trained, isn't aware that the documentation is there. So I wouldn't necessarily link the operating effectiveness testing failure back to design effectiveness testing. It's possible to pass design effectiveness, but fail control operating effectiveness. Sorry. So yeah, most operating effectiveness testing that fails that I see are more around awareness and training, basically, and guidance around the documentation that already lives. Someone just has a question, or sorry, a comment here. For acceptance sampling guidelines, look at MIL Standard 105D and its successors. So I must admit I'm actually not overly familiar with that myself, but hopefully that's a useful piece of information for everyone on the call. I think that's really it. I'm just looking down through the Q&A here. So unless anyone has any other questions, we'll do the usual where we send out, as I said, the recording of the webinar, the slides that go with it. And if anyone does have any questions, my email address will be at the in the last slide as well. So please do feel free to get in touch directly or reach out to any of us here on the team if you have any specific questions on control testing or anything else. Thanks a million for your time, everyone.